At this point, the controller has pretty much been figured out. I mean, we're in a good resting point to where these companies are just kind of adding little tweaks and additions here and there each generation. But of course, it wasn't always like that. And I mean, several generations ago, we were at this interesting crossroads with 3D gaming showing up and everyone trying to figure out how exactly to introduce a controller and design it around this new perspective in gaming. Well, there was one company that nailed it so much that they're still kind of rolling with that exact setup. And really, you could say it's one of the greatest controllers of all time because of the influence it's had on the industry. And that's what we're going to look at here today. Back 30 years ago, we were used to a basic controller layout with a D-pad and some face buttons. Sure, the Super Nintendo added a few shoulder buttons from the NES, and the Sega Genesis eventually rolled with 6 face buttons, but it was a pretty standard layout across the board. Even when the PlayStation showed up with shapes for buttons and a strange looking D-pad, it still looks similar to the SNES controller with a couple of extra shoulder buttons and some handles. It wasn't until the Nintendo 64 showed up with this insane looking controller sporting an analog stick that the game began to change. Having 3D Mario jump out of a pipe to kick off Mario 64, immediately introducing you to 3D movement with a joystick that was the default way to play this system, was a complete shift to the game console scene. Of course, Sony wasn't going to stand around and watch this happen, especially not after the fast start they experienced with the PS1. So a year later, not only would they work to introduce a controller to double up on Nintendo's analog stick ambitions, they also decided to shock the industry. I mean, yeah, it's called the DualShock, so literally Sony did introduce something that shocked the industry just by its name alone. Now, it is worth mentioning that Sony was playing around with the idea of joysticks for the PS1 before the N64 released with their analog joystick controller. It basically looks like a big flight stick, and while that's the main inspiration I take away from the design, it does work with analog-enabled games, so hey, if you want, you can run around in Spyro using this thing. A year later, the dual analog controller was released, getting closer to that modern PlayStation design, just without the rumble. I did an entire video and teardown for this one, so check that out if you want to hear more. Finally, by the end of 1997 in Japan, the DualShock was released to the market, and then it followed up the next year in the US with a release. This is the controller that changed everything for Sony going forward. Dual analog sticks, a slightly larger controller footprint for better ergonomics, and stereo rumble motors. That's right, we have HD rumble now, but back then, just having 2 rumble motors that could be tapped into for each game depending on the situation was a pretty big deal. At the time, Nintendo had the rumble pack for their N64 console, an attachment that had the advantage of being compatible with already purchased controllers, but also needed batteries to function. Sony decided to move their rumble inside the controller completely and even double up. I picked this one up at a local secondhand store. It's the rebranded one that Sony issued a few years after the original release, and it was paired with the smaller PS1 console. It's certainly seen better days, so we're going to clean it up real quick during the teardown and try to get it back to, like, newish condition, I'll say. All right, let's take a quick look around here for a bit of a before picture. Some of the buttons are a little sticky, and there is caked on dirt everywhere. It was only $10, so I can't complain too much, especially since there aren't any deep scratches and no real discoloration to worry about. Only a few Phillips head screws hold the controller together, but be careful here since these screws will strip easily on you. Take your time with some light pressure as you back out these screws, because trying to remove a stripped screw with how narrow these screw holes are is a nightmare. With the back off, we can immediately see our rumble motor sitting in either handle. You'll notice each motor is a different size, and this was on purpose. One was a bit smaller and could be activated for more subtle vibrations, with the other, larger motor moving slower but having a much heavier impact. Both can also be activated at the same time for max intensity, but this was a very clever solution that is still utilized to this day, with Microsoft currently being the last holdout. There's really only one screw left that's holding the main board down, so once removed, it's ready to come out. Don't forget the top ribbon cable first, though, which leads to a major point for this particular DualShock. With the first iteration, Sony still kept a separate circuit board for the buttons, but once they moved to this PS1 controller, they redesigned things to use what amounts to a large ribbon cable instead. There's a plastic piece inside that the cable is pressed against and records any button presses, eliminating the need to wire together 2 separate boards. I'm sure it made manufacturing this controller much easier and cheaper, without really affecting quality, since it's the same method used for several following generations of PlayStation controllers, including the current DualSense to a degree. With the main board and cables removed, the buttons just pop out, leaving us with all the plastics that need to be cleaned. Since it looks to be some pretty basic dirt and grime, some soap and water should get the job done. I think sometimes people tend to overthink what needs to be done to clean up a controller like this, and really a good brush and some dish soap with water is all you really need 90% of the time. This one was pretty dirty, so it took a good bit of scrubbing, but one by one, the parts were starting to look much better. I went through and cleaned all the plastics along with the thumbsticks and then rinsed everything off and let it air dry overnight. All right, now it's time for reassembly, and it doesn't take long to get everything back together, with the only real annoying part being the top cable that needs to be threaded a certain way so the main board lays down flat. Also, be careful with the rumble motor wires. One did come free on me and I had to solder it back down. Not a big deal for me, but probably not fun if you don't have a soldering iron available. Okay, with the final screws in, this DualShock is looking way better. The before and after pictures really show just how dirty this controller was and how much of a difference a basic clean can make. There are a few spots that seem to be scuffed a bit too much to come out, but overall, I think it came out pretty good. Each button press feels great with immediate spring back, and the thumbsticks cleaned up better than I was expecting, with the top texture still having some grip to it. Because this was introduced midway through the generation, not every game supported the DualShock. You can see at the bottom between the sticks, there's a button that controls this red light. It tells the PS1 if the controller is in analog or digital mode, basically if it should be expecting inputs from the joysticks or the D-pad. It was a bit awkward at the time figuring out which games would use these new features beyond just substituting the D-pad, but a few standouts really set the stage for the next generation. Ape Escape is the most famous since it was the first one that I remember actually requiring the DualShock controller to play, using both sticks for the game mechanics around catching apes. I remember one of my friends getting the demo disc that had Ape Escape, and they were unable to play it because they didn't have a DualShock controller, at least not until later on. Gran Turismo tapped into the different rumble motor sensations depending on if you were driving across gravel or running into other cars. There is also support for analog steering using the joystick for more fine-tuning when going around corners as opposed to the digital D-pad presses. C12 is a third-person shooter that used the analog sticks in a more familiar way now, with the left stick moving your character and the right stick moving the camera. Would be nice, I think, to be able to fix the inverted controls here for the camera when you're looking around, but at this time, it was pretty impressive to see a game using dual analog sticks like this. It really does sound basic, but this wasn't as common back then and actually makes the game feel much more modern now than you would expect. Metal Gear Solid has to be one of my favorite uses of rumble, with Psycho Mantis using his mind to move your controller after you set it on the ground. All this, by the way, blew my mind when I was younger. I mean, it was obvious how it was all happening with the rumble motors going off and shaking the controller across the table, but the fourth wall breaking nature of this and reading your memory card is just one of those moments in gaming that's imprinted in my memory. Oh, and Capcom wanted to take advantage of the DualShock, but they had already released Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2, so what do? They introduced a whole new game for you to buy so that it could have DualShock support. See, the patches now for some of these online enabled games, while they can be annoying because you may have to download it day one and it's several gigabytes, not so bad when you realize that option not being available means just be another $49.99. But hey, at least now you can go back in time and be annoyed at the tank controls, this time with a full analog stick. When it was all said and done, Sony introduced a controller that really set the tone for PlayStation going forward. I mean, it's a setup that is still used to this day, with the familiar analog stick placement with the D-pad and face buttons. Sure, some features have been added like the touchpad and speaker, but it's pretty clear Sony adopted the if it ain't broke, don't fix it strategy with their PlayStation controllers going forward. Eventually, Nintendo even moved the rumble motor inside their controller with the GameCube and introduced a second analog stick. Microsoft showed up with a similar design, but just with offset sticks instead. To this day, the DualShock is seen as one of the greatest controllers ever made, and I'll admit it's hard to argue with the influence it had on the industry and how Sony basically rolled with the design for the PS2 and the PS3. Let me know what you think about the first DualShock controller, though, down below, whether you had one back in the day or just recently learned about it. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.